My name is Gabrielle Moser, and I'm a photography historian. I'm also a writer and a curator. And over the past year, I've been looking in local, provincial, and national archives for photographs that don't really exist. I've been searching for the presence of Canadian citizens before 1947, the date that the country's first citizenship laws were passed. While much of the world inaugurated citizen status in the 18th century, Canadian citizenship is only 70 years old, and it's only been legally guaranteed for Indigenous peoples since 1960. But there is nonetheless a rich photographic record of people of color using the camera to position themselves as citizens, and of Indigenous peoples constituting communities outside the nation state in the lead up to 1947. And these claims are often made somewhat paradoxically through the strategy of refusal. Refusal can be registered in the negative, as in refusing to follow an unjust law, refusing to move, or refusing to participate. But refusal can also be a productive strategy that generates new kinds of collectivity and belonging. And what I want to think about with you today are the ways in which we might try to be unruly citizens of Canada. My model has been, for the last year, Viola Desmond, a Halifax beautician and beauty school owner who on November 8th, 1946, performed a spontaneous act of civil disobedience by refusing to sit in the segregated part of a movie theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. On her way to Sydney to conduct business, Desmond's car had broken down, and she was passing time in the movies, waiting for repairs. There was no camera present throughout what came next, but I imagine the events unfolding in a series of untaken photographs. A photograph of the cinema lobby shows Desmond, her hair perfectly coiffed, a fur stole draped over her shoulders, and a handbag tucked into the crook of one elbow, standing at the ticket booth, where she's asking 3 times for admission to the orchestra level. The cashier refuses and insists on selling her a ticket to the balcony instead. The next image is so dimly lit the figures are nearly obscured, but if you squint, you can make out Desmond's profile in the back of the orchestra, where she has turned in her seat to respond to the theater manager standing in the aisle. He demands that she leave and threatens to call the police. An exterior view of the cinema marquee taken from the sidewalk a few moments later shows Desmond being carried out of the building towards a taxi waiting at the curb, her shoulders tightly grasped by a police officer while the manager carries her feet. A shoe is missing, as is her handbag. In an image taken 1 hour later, Desmond is in a county jail cell. Her shoe has been retrieved, as has her purse, and she sits bolt upright on a cot, a single bare bulb casting shadows on the cinder block wall behind her. 2 more photographs taken days later in the bleak light of a physician's exam room document bruises on her shoulders and ankles. These images are an important part of the archive of early civil rights activism in Canada, but they don't exist. The photograph of Desmond that does exist is a studio portrait of her taken 6 years earlier, in which she gazes seriously but serenely into the camera. It has illustrated stories about Desmond's fate for the last 7 decades, including coverage of her conviction for defrauding the Canadian government of 1 cent, the difference in cost between a balcony and an orchestra ticket. Desmond appealed these charges all the way to the Supreme Court, and while she was not successful, her legal challenge is credited with ending segregation in Nova Scotia. And if Desmond's portrait isn't immediately familiar to you, it soon will be. It's this portrait that will appear on the new $10 bill when Desmond becomes the first woman to appear on Canadian currency in 2018. And it should be a prompt for us every time we look at it to imagine all of the other untaken photographs of this woman and the actions of activists like her, who across the country, from Halifax to Dresden, Ontario, to Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, refused to be ruled by laws that did not include them as citizens in the first place. Whenever I tell this story, I want to identify with Desmond's quiet and spontaneous act of disobedience, and with her everyday practices of political organizing as a Black beautician. And I refuse, however unconsciously, to identify with the position of the white theater manager, Henry McNeil, even though I'm complicit with the same systems of power and domination that allowed him to yell at Desmond in her seat, to call the police, and to physically haul her 4'11" frame out of her seat. I read about his actions through Desmond's words, and I'm astonished by and ashamed of the white entitlement that made it legal and acceptable for McNeil to not only carry out this violence against a black woman, but then to go to the absurd length of informing the government that she had committed tax evasion to protect his privilege and power. 19 days ago, I experienced another kind of refusal of identification with white identity politics. On May 12th, I wrote the following email to the organizers of this talk. Dear Leanne, dear David, I'm writing to you today about the upcoming Walrus Talks in Toronto to let you know I'm withdrawing my participation from this event. It's been brought to my attention today that Ken White, the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for Rogers, and Jonathan Kay, the Editor-in-Chief of The Walrus, are personally promoting for an appropriation prize on social media to be given to support the right of implicitly white writers to imagine the lives of others. I will not participate in a project that supports acts of white supremacy, which is clearly what this prize is about. If there is any hope for the future of Canada and the desire for a better country, it starts with listening to the perspectives, experiences, and demands of Indigenous peoples, Black people, and people of color in this country, not encouraging the ongoing and already rampant appropriation of their stories and experiences for the white settler colonial imagination. I wrote this email, but I did not send it, because I was reminded that one of the other things that white entitlement does is it allows white people to become invisible. Whiteness allows people like myself to walk away from difficult conversations with other white people, to avoid the uncomfortable confrontation with our colleagues when they refuse to listen, refuse to acknowledge, refuse to apologize. Kay, for instance, resigned from his position at the Walrus, but explicitly stated it was over ongoing creative disagreements with the publication. He never apologized. So while Indigenous authors Gregory Schofield and Leanne Simpson removed their written work from the Walrus website, and Tanya Chijak circulated a list of all the white editors who promised money to this prize, most of the white writers and editors I know remained comfortably silent. Refusal is an act that asserts personal integrity. But in this year of marking 150 years of settler colonialism in Canada, refusal can also be a gesture that tries to repair a collective integrity. I will not be silent. I refuse to accept these absurd acts of white entitlement as business as usual. I refuse to treat white identity politics as normal, natural, or invisible. And I refuse to forget that, as Jesse Wente reminded everyone, there already is an appropriation prize. It's called Canada. If citizens in Canada have any hope of improving our future, it has to start with us being able to address ourselves and our history, and to articulate the positions we occupy and have inherited. It involves looking more closely and listening more carefully for the claims of fellow citizens that we at first failed to perceive. Thank you.